We are taught to fear about running out of gas, but oxygen toxicity is the opposite problem, and it can become dangerous before many divers really understand what their computer is warning them about. In this video, I'll break down what that PPO2 that you see on your dive computer actually means, why oxygen can become a risk underwater, and what the new guidance changes for divers like us. But before we get into the new limits, let's make sure partial pressure feels simple first. In a nutshell, partial pressure is the fraction of gas multiplied by the absolute pressure you're breathing in. When we breathe air at 1 atmosphere of Earth, we inhale 21% oxygen. The rest is 79% inert gas, mostly nitrogen that your body doesn't use. We don't need it, we just expel it. So the partial pressure of oxygen at the surface is 0.21 ATA, or atmospheres. Now, the tricky part comes from when you're diving. You get submerged with more water, and every 10 meters or 33 feet in seawater is an additional atmosphere. But when you breathe, that gas is now delivered at ambient pressure, which is the pressure around you at the time you're breathing. The oxygen percentage stays the same in the cylinder, but the gas is denser as you're breathing. So each breath you take contains more breaths based on the atmospheres that you're under. Effectively, each breath contains more oxygen molecules and more nitrogen molecules than at the surface. That is why you multiply the oxygen fraction by the number of atmospheres you are under to get your PPO2. If you're at 3 atmospheres, or rather 20 meters or 66 feet, air is 0.21 oxygen fraction. So you multiply 0.21 by 3 and get 0.63 PPO2. So effectively, you take a lot of extra oxygen in with that breath, along with nitrogen. 1 breath is equal to 3 breaths of air at the surface, and that's fascinating. Physics. And this is, of course, also why your gas drops so much faster the deeper you are. This causes some concern. As you're aware, all that extra nitrogen has to off-gas, which does present its own problems, which I do speak a lot more to in the video up here. Check that out if you're interested. But oxygen is used by the body, so no problem, right? Mostly. But here's the thing. Too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. A quick high-level understanding that I can give is this. Your body's cells use oxygen to create vital energy throughout a component called mitochondria. I visualize these things as little engines inside your cells. They create energy, like little nuclear power plants that need to be contained. And the mitochondria normally do a great job at containing all the radiation from the process. But when oxygen levels are very high, your body can produce a more reactive oxygen species. And instead of clean energy, it is like the engine starts spitting out sparks. We call these sparks free radicals. And when those sparks overwhelm your normal defenses, they can contribute to disruptive signaling, especially in your nervous system. That can show up as slight muscle twitches, blurry vision, and in rare cases, partial or full body grand mal seizures. Of course, any seizure happening while diving is extremely unideal, as you can imagine. It can be very deadly. We divers generally call this oxygen toxicity, or oxtox for short. These symptoms are warning signs. Treat twitching and visual changes as early warnings. If you feel them, reduce exertion, improve ventilation, and if you can do so safely, go shallower to reduce your PPO2 with your buddy. Ideally, abort the dive immediately. But mostly, obviously, most of us are out there diving every single day without over-jazzing on oxygen and going into full seizures. So when does this become a problem exactly? To find out, let's take a page from our history book. Modern oxygen exposure limits trace back to wartime research that needed quick answers for combat divers and submarine crews. In particular, the United Kingdom and others were motivated by real combat swimmer operations in World War II. If divers could be weaponized and trained to safely do missions underwater, that's a win. And many early closed-circuit systems used 100% oxygen for stealth. But it was a known safety issue that convulsions occurred after some time breathing 100% oxygen at depth. This real safety issue was a blocker to combat-ready divers, and thus, funding was made available to understand it more. This led to real operations, not classroom theory. And a lot of testing happened in controlled chambers on young, fit military men. Researchers document enormous individual variability, even on identical exposures and identical shapes and identically fit men. Even certain men coming every single day had a lot of a variance in their own symptoms, with symptoms onset ranging from minutes to hours. And as mentioned, the same person on trials can vary a lot. Some subjects seized at levels considered acceptable, while others tolerated extreme exposures with no event. And the data spread of all these different symptoms occurring defied any neat hypothesis. Even the highest outliers could not just be dismissed. That could be someone's life. This is no doubt a real safety issue for divers, and potentially going into full convulsions underwater is unacceptable risk. Other interesting pieces observed were that immersion and exercise tended to reduce oxygen tolerance, so symptoms increased. And heavy workload and CO2 buildup made things even worse. But who would get symptoms and breakdown remained frustratingly unpredictable. Because individual predictions failed, agencies adopted conservative ceilings designed to minimize observed seizures across groups, rather than guaranteeing personal safety. Or in other words, instead of taking the average of the spread of the data, they took the top outliers. And those are basically what we use for our guidance today, the top outliers. But these are still outliers for fit young men. That is why the numbers we use today and that you know were set as a practical ceiling instead of personal thresholds. What's interesting here is that with the research since then, there has been relatively little change from these initial findings. There has been more studies, but they mostly just kind of fine-tune the original statements. There are more details of different maximum advised times for different inspired oxygen pressures, which we'll get into a little bit more shortly. For example, in the NOAA 1991 oxygen exposure tables, an inspired PO2 of 1.3 has a normal single exposure limit of 180 minutes, with a 24-hour maximum of 210 minutes and 240 minutes listed only as an exceptional exposure. I'm mentioning this because a lot of our dive computers and training traditions still imply and reflect that older 1.3 about 3-hour mindset. And the problem with that becomes obvious when you compare the chamber population to today's recreational divers, who are generally older and more diverse than relatively fit young men in the military, and diving in dynamic ocean conditions with variable workload too. So let's take a look at the math that turns a friendly mix into a risk. Over time, PADI and other recreational training agencies advocated that 1.4 ppO2 made sense for the working portion of a dive. Those numbers line up with common agency practice and NOAA style exposure guidance. And the reason why it's 1.4, which is beyond the 1.3 recommendation, is because generally recreational divers don't spend as long time down in the water as what they were doing in the study. Usually it's about roughly around an hour, and then you come back and change cylinders. So 1.4 was agreed to be fairly safe. And those numbers line up with common agency practice and NOAA style exposure guidance, where 1.4 is treated as a planning limit for working portions, and there is a 1.6 as a contingency or stop ceiling. And 1.6 is something more that CCR divers and technical divers need to be more concerned with, as they spend a lot of time underwater. But for recreational divers with a single cylinder, where they spend a surface interval out of the water, 1.4 ppO2 became the common standard advisory. For tech and CCR diving, when at rest and not working, often for decompression stops, the advisory is commonly set to 1.6 ppO2. And by not working here, generally means floating, stable, and minimizing exertion. And even with that, there still has been rare incidents of divers convulsing, even at rest at 1.6 ppO2. So it's not entirely safe. But for the most part, we agree it's safe enough. It is a widely used ceiling with low risk, not zero risk, for tech divers and CCR divers, and only for that decompression when you're ascending back to the surface. Otherwise, just to be clear, 1.4 is the standard acceptable partial pressure most of us dive with for recreational diving. But okay, so what does all this mean with partial pressures and convulsing, and how do we prevent it? Let's take a look at our partial pressures again and see how it associates with depth. Once we understand that, preventing it will become clear. If we take a single cylinder filled with air with our recreational advisory of 1.4 ppO2 to 40 meters or 130 feet, we will be fine. That's 5 atmospheres times 0.21, which makes 1.05 ppO2. We won't be in danger from oxygen toxicity. But what about 60 meters or about 200 feet? That's 7 atmospheres times 0.21, which makes 1.47. That is beyond the common working limit with less margin. But here is the thing to remember. From the research, the divergence in when someone shows central nervous system oxygen toxicity can be unpredictable. So a brief dip into higher ppO2 may be fine, often is fine, and most of the time it's just fine. But the higher that ppO2 goes, or the longer time you spend exposed to a higher ppO2, the more you're gambling with your safety. Because remember, the risk goes up proportional to higher that ppO2 goes, above 1.3 or 1.4. And the timeline for a seizure can be minutes, if not seconds. But often, it can be longer, and it can change day to day. You're rolling the dice. Often diving is about risk management and assessing how much risk you're comfortable with. In general, it's good for us divers to not take chances with this kind of thing. But here is where things get extra spicy. We've been looking at air, and as we all know, many agencies cap recreational training at 40 meters or 130 feet for good reason, and with appropriate training to keep it safe and enjoyable. But for nitrox gases, where we increase oxygen in the cylinder for other benefits, which I cover up here in this video, let us enjoy longer and safer dives at intermediate depths. But there is some risk, as we learned here. More oxygen means higher risk of oxygen toxicity at a given depth. So let's take a look at a common nitrox mix of 32% oxygen and a dive that will be down to our max recreational depths of 40 meters or 130 feet. That's 5 atmospheres times 0.32, and that puts us right at 1.6 ppO2. And that is too high to call appropriate for working bottom time. You're not guaranteed seizures, but you're definitely putting more at risk than you should. You would be taking unnecessary risk with that profile. We'd always want to calculate the maximum operating depth, or MOD, for the gas in our tank. So if we're taking a cylinder filled with 32% nitrox, or rather oxygen, we can calculate that MOD by taking our desired ppO2, so in this case 1.4, and dividing it by the oxygen in our cylinder, or rather the fraction of it, so 0.32. So that would be 1.4 divided by 0.32. Get the result and then subtract 1, and then times it by 10 for meters or 33 for feet. And that gives us 33.75 meters or 111 feet. Thus, we always must calculate or at least know our MOD for the gas in our cylinder, and ensure we only breathe it at or shallower than that depth. This is the only way to mitigate the risk. There is very likely a lot of conservatism in the MOD, and we want that. Remember, the science that gave us those maximum depths is off of outliers, but those outliers are still healthy young men in the military. So keep all that in mind. And there's no guarantee that you won't be an outlier yourself. So we don't want to play with fire, breathing it deeper than the MOD. The rule is simple. Plan your mix for the deepest point of the dive, not the average depth. If you're enjoying this video, now is a great time to like and subscribe. I post weekly content, help divers grow their skills, build confidence, and explore the ocean with curiosity and care. And if you find this video valuable, please do share it with others. And if you're looking to be caught up on the latest and greatest of the scuba diving industry, I have a free monthly newsletter that you can check out in a link in the description below. I'll see you there. And getting back to Ox Talks, it's also important to remember that other risk factors are CO2 buildup and workload. CO2 builds when your ventilation can't keep up with production. Or in other words, your body's working too hard and you're not breathing out fast enough. Or you're rebreathing too much CO2 as well. Your body's trying to expel a lot of CO2, it's also competing for resources to expel nitrogen as well. And all this happens with hard finning, stress, skip breathing, high gas density at depth, and in a CCR, things like loop issues or poor tuning. Anything that traps CO2 raises your odds. Heat and cold also matter, mainly because they change how hard you work and how much CO2 you retain. So more conservatism is needed in the case of being too hot or too cold. But there's also another twist to oxygen toxicity. Even at PPO2 values that seem safe, seizures can still happen, especially when CO2 is high. It is not perfectly understood, and there is a time-based component too. And this matters more when you're breathing very high oxygen mixes for long periods, like rich deco gases at shallow stops. For most recreational dives using nitrox gas, depth is the dominant factor for PPO2. Time becomes a bigger conversation when you're doing long exposures, repetitive high oxygen days, or breathing rich deco gases. Even at depths as shallow as 6 meters or 20 feet, 100% oxygen gives you a PPO2 of about 1.6. In addition, breathing higher oxygen for longer periods can cause coughing and tissue irritation in your lungs over time. That part's not deadly, and you'll heal naturally just by breathing normal air. But what all this means is you must be aware of the timetables and total oxygen exposure over the dive days and using nitrox, and basically try to stay well away from the edge cases in the old experiments. We don't want to become an outlier. None of us want to discover that we're an outlier. But here's where things get even more interesting. A very recent guideline update changed how we think about some of these timetables at 1.3. Let's take a look there next. For decades, we were taught that time at elevated oxygen was a double-edged sword. We knew that breathing higher partial pressures of oxygen would eventually stress the body in two specific ways. First, we were worried about pulmonary toxicity. This is literally the toxicity of the lungs. We tracked OTUs, or oxygen toxicity units, to avoid it. We knew that if you breathed high oxygen for too long, it would physically irritate the lung tissues. As mentioned earlier, it's not as dangerous as seizures. But breathing gas causing you to cough a lot is certainly a different issue, especially for some that are easier to have irritated lungs. But the second big issue here, and the bigger fear, was the CNS, or central nervous system toxicity. This is the CNS clock on your dive computer. We believe that time itself was a potential trigger for convulsions, and many divers mentally anchored to the older NOAA style limits, like 180 minutes, that's the 3 hours we talked about earlier, for the normal single exposure at 1.3 PPO2. Our best belief was as the PPO2 climbed in your system over time, you were inching closer to a sudden seizure and drowning. Because of this fear, the guidance at 1.3 felt extremely rigid. But recent research has adjusted what can be justified at an inspired PO2 of 1.3. Specifically, the 2025 revised guideline by Hoyt, Mitchell, and colleagues focused on the evidence for 1.3 PPO2 because that is the common CCR set point. They reviewed the evidence and concluded the risk of seizure at 1.3 is lower than the older tables implied for technical dive profiles. The new consensus extends allowable time at 1.3 up to 4 hours of working exposure, plus another 4 hours at resting decompression. And by working, we're talking about bottom time, when you are actively swimming around and potentially being task loaded. Resting decompression means stable position, minimal exertion, and controlled breathing during the stops, all within a 24-hour period. That is a massive shift. It suggests that the CNS clock on your dive computer can be way more conservative than we've thought prior. But it's still not a guarantee. Oxygen toxicity is still a little unpredictable. And CO2 buildup, if you're stressed or working hard, is still a massive trigger. It is the trigger that pulls the oxygen toxicity gun. So if you're working hard, stressed, or breathing dense gas deep you are increasing your risk. Now, here's the catch. This does not mean 1.6 ppO2 suddenly becomes a longer time working limit. It is still treated as a ceiling, not a target. More time at oxygen-rich exposures can still cause lung irritation from the pulmonary toxicity, and that can feel more like a dry cough as you're breathing, a burning sensation in your chest, or difficulty taking a deep breath. And if you develop a persistent dry cough, chest burning, or tightness, be conservative in diving and give your lungs some time to recover. So on those multi-day trips where you're breathing a lot of oxygen-rich gases, your lungs may become the practical bottleneck before you ever see CNS symptoms. So how do we handle this? First, take a gas break when it makes sense. If you've been diving 5 or so days on rich nitrox of like 32%, it might make sense to take a day off and just breathe standard air for a day of diving to give your lungs and body a break. Or you can even just take a half day off of diving. Second, monitor your breathing. If your chest feels tight or you develop a persistent dry cough, stop diving until it resolves. And third, watch your workload and CO2. With recreational nitrox, the easiest way to control this is to avoid deep, high work dives on dense gas, and to keep your trim, buoyancy, and breathing relaxed. Those are the reasons the update draws clean lines between working time and resting time at the same inspired PO2. In the end, the biggest risk of oxygen-enriched diving isn't just a number on the screen. It is the gap between the sterile lab tests and the dynamic ocean. We now know that while some time limits at 1.3 are more generous than we thought, oxtalk is not perfectly predictable. So close that gap. Respect your MOD, manage your workload to keep CO2 low, and give your lungs a break before they ask for one. In this video, we covered the dangers of too much oxygen in the body, but there's also another danger, nitrogen. And I tried to cover that in good detail up here. You can check it out next. Or YouTube thinks you might like this video over here. You can check that out as well. The more you know, the more you'll love and protect the ocean. Until next time.